Thank you for joining us for the 2026 Winter Lecture Series. I'm Mike Zarfos. I'm the Executive Director of Great Mountain Forest. This series every year is sponsored by Molly Ackerley and Michael Sconiers, and we greatly appreciate their support. This particular lecture, though, is a collaboration between Great Mountain Forest and the Norfolk Nature Alliance, represented today by Susanna Wood.
Just because we were together at dinner last night, that's the only reason I'm speaking for the Alliance. Just briefly, we started last year as a loose group of environmental groups here in town just to work together to enhance our efforts to help our ecosystem and expand our reach. So that's it.
And the theme that the Nature Alliance this year is trying to weave into a lot of their programming is native plants and native, landscaping, native focused management, and pollinators are a big part of that. So today we're joined by Dr. Kass Urban-Mead, a pollinator conservation biologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and an NRCS, that's Natural Resource Conservation Service of the USDA, partner biologist. Kass earned her master's at the Yale University School of Forestry and her PhD in entomology at Cornell University. She now supports landowners and land managers across the region by creating and stewarding habitats that benefit native pollinators. She develops practical guides, trainings, and management plans. Dr. Urban-Mead has contributed to and led high-impact research published in leading scientific journals. It's very cool stuff. As someone who came from the science world, it's very cool stuff, including work that took her quite literally up into the trees as she studied wild bees in forest canopies. Her research helps us to understand how healthy forests support diverse native bees and how that can translate into more pollinator activity in nearby agricultural areas. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kass Urban-Mead.
Hi everyone. I've already grabbed my little plate of grapes because I couldn't resist. So, hi. Thanks Susanna. Thanks Mike. Thanks Becky, Eileen, Andrew, Chris, Molly, and Michael. So many of you, what a cool and amazing town and coalition of people. So it's really an honor to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm Kass. Mike did an amazing job introducing me. I'm not going to show that many pictures of tree climbing, so I thought I should be like, it's really fun to be in the canopy with bees, but I'm going to try to do a more kind of synthetic set of overview of the biology that we know today. So I'm going to jump right in. I know this is about an hour-and-a-half session. I kind of planned that I can chat for up to an hour, really, with this presentation, but I think as we get near the end, I'm happy to transition that into Q&A and have that last as long as we feel good about. So, yeah. I think that'll go away. There we go. So just to start off, if you aren't familiar with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, it's a bit of a mouthful. We are a nonprofit that is named after the extinct Xerces blue butterfly, which went extinct mid-last century due to habitat loss. And our founder, Robert Pyle, was inspired both, I think, by the cool name, but also the X to remind us to work against continuing extinction of other insects and other invertebrates. And I kind of like summarizing our philosophy as a nonprofit by understanding that the fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. We, of course, are reliant on insects and other invertebrates for nutrient cycling, pest control, food web integrity, and, of course, pollination, which is what I spend most of my time thinking about. And we work really practically, to the best of our abilities, to meet the actual constraints of policies, communities, governments, complex social, political landscapes to enact practical and invertebrate conservation recommendations, best stewardship practices, policy recommendations, etc. We work very hard to be motivated by the most current science and constantly update and iterate our recommendations as we learn new things from the scientific community, but also know that the urgency of these conservation actions is great enough, and there's enough known already that we know enough to act now, is kind of the Xerces philosophy, to get started and then to do better and better every year as we can. So I can't take credit for this beautiful graphic that my colleague put together, but I think it does a great job of just summarizing, especially for those of you who might not like bugs very much, which I hope you will by the end of this talk. But even if you don't, maybe you'll feel reminded of their underpinnings, which include a crucial role in the food web for many other parts of wildlife and the ecosystem functioning. Of course, they provide biological pest control as both predators and parasitoids in both wild and managed ecosystems. They pollinate an extremely high percentage of both our wild and crop plants, contributing not only to the actual ability of a plant to set fruit, but also to the quality and quantity of that fruit that is produced once the pollination is done. Some of our invertebrates are really crucial seed dispersers. Many ants, for example, do that in our early spring forests. We have a whole team that works on mussels, so we love highlighting the importance of some invertebrates for water filtration and water quality. And soil health, of course, an incredibly complex undersoil community. And I have a wonderful colleague who works across the Connecticut River Valley who does a lot of work with dung beetles. So if you're on the lookout, I can point you towards Julie Michelson. She's a delight. And we know that many of our invertebrates, unfortunately, are declining. And there's not one smoking gun, but instead many drivers with which this room, I'm sure, will be familiar. We often summarize this as death by 1,000 cuts, which can feel overwhelming and disheartening, but I also think that it can feel empowering because it means there may be a piece of this puzzle that any one of us can plug into that may be something we do have the skills, resources, or access to contribute to. Habitat loss, land management, resource competition, pesticides, disease, climate change, all synergistic or interacting in different contexts. And we are a nonprofit, and so I just want to thank anyone who is a Xerces member. Right now, this has been a tumultuous year for funding, as I'm sure we've all experienced in different complicated ways, and truly it has been our member base that has carried us through this year, and we were able to make it with all our staff, and we're just so grateful for the support of our members. So if you are moved after our talk today, or if you are already a member, thank you so much for considering joining. All right, with that out of the way, on with the show. Time to talk about bees in the forest. So I want to talk about a little background today. Why do we even start looking for bees in the woods at all? Seems kind of counterintuitive. And then talk about this category of bees that we've started to categorize increasingly in the scientific community as forest associated. And then really the bulk of this, and I'm super excited that I think it was Becky was saying, you know, we should give you a whole hour because you've got a lot of natural history stories. So hopefully we can kind of tell a bunch of fun stories so that when you're out in the forest the next time, maybe you have a bunch of different tools in your toolbox to start to notice the ways that the bees connect to the woods. And then we'll try to tie it all together with some actionable steps. So, all right, what's a pollinator and what's a bee? I think these are words that we all use all the time probably, but don't always define. And I like to kind of simplify it here to a pollinator is any animal, often an insect, could also be wind or water, but it's frequently an insect that transfers pollen from one plant to another, allowing it to reproduce by setting seed and fruit. And bees are some of our most effective pollinators. They visit many, many flowers in the course of a day, in the course of their lifetime, to collect large amounts of pollen, which they carry back to their nests using specialized branched hairs. We'll talk about those in a moment, because these hairs and the fact that they're collecting their food from plants is what differentiates them from wasps. And commonly, we all use the word bee in common language to kind of mean any of those things that are bees and wasps. But formally, well, this isn't the most formal way, but it's actually relatively maps onto the formal definition. I like to say bees are the fuzzy vegetarian cousins of wasps because they don't feed their larvae like this wasp does on other insects or other invertebrates. They feed their larvae on a plant part, which is pollen. So that makes them vegetarian. And they have these specialized branched hairs that they developed over evolutionary time that mean that they're exceptionally good at bringing that pollen back to their nest. It also means that they're a little bit messy because there's those hairs on their body, and that means that they are more likely than a wasp to drop that pollen on another flower, which actually is what contributes to the pollination activity, allowing that plant to set fruit, right? So next time somebody says, "That bee got me," and you're like, "Well, was it a fuzzy vegetarian wasp?" It goes over really well at parties. So I'm not going to do that many of these big overwhelming figures, but I just thought this is an incredible figure showing evolutionary time here on the left, and what this radiation or the expansion of flowering plants happens way back here. And then around 130 million years ago, the first common ancestor of today's wasps and bees, we like to say, kind of figured out that they could raise their babies on this pollen and nectar. And once that diversification started, this enormous radiation of thousands and thousands of kinds of bees who connect to different flowers in different ways was able to diversify across the globe. As soon as they figured out that instead of catching caterpillars or spiders or something else to feed their babies, they could use these flowers that suddenly were everywhere. So we have over 20,000 species of bees worldwide. Honeybees are 7 species, I think. Usually 1 around here though, Apis mellifera, the common western honeybee. And so of these 20,000 species of bees in 7 different families, the Stenotrididae are pretty much only in Australia, so we've got 6 families of bees that are around here. And we have 388 species in Connecticut. And this checklist was actually just recently released and updated by Tracy Zarillo and some other amazing folks at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station in New Haven. I noticed one little line that called out my senior thesis bees at Yale, and it made me very excited and happy. So they got us up to 388, and that's an incredible document online. You can read all about the natural history of your Connecticut bees, so just couldn't highlight that enough. And here on this slide, I have some pictures of bees that might seem surprising to you, right? We've got a shiny green bee. We've got this white fuzzy one. We've got this one in the middle here who all her pollen is on her underbelly, right? That's not how we learn about bees carrying their pollen on their legs. They have all these different ways of interacting with flowers. There's ones that are almost as tiny as the tip of a pencil, and others that are, as big as a quarter. And they range in enormous size variation and have enormous variation in life cycle as well. All right, so I'm going to kind of introduce 2 major life cycles that I think will help us understand how bees use the woods, but we want this as our background, okay? So the vast majority of our wild bees are solitary. They only live briefly as adults, and the rest of their lives are spent in juvenile stages below ground or otherwise in their nests, which might be stems or wood nests. Very different than a traditional managed honeybee hive, which we're all familiar with. That was my first bee that I ever fell in love with too, right? And then, so let me show you what this can look like. This is an example life cycle, maybe you can see this, of a solitary bee who flies in the springtime. So it may have overwintered as a pupae. This is a timeline across from left to right there, from January to January. And then in the spring, when the climate conditions are just right, that larvae will finish developing into an adult, emerge up out of the ground if they're soil nesting, and then that's when we see them on flowers, right, is during that brief period of time. And they're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to their nest every time they collect enough pollen, dropping that pollen off at their nest and going back out for more. So they're pretty constrained to the area around which their nest is based. And they make as many of those little pollen balls wherever their nest is in that short activity period as an adult. And then the adult dies, and those babies wait underground, developing. They overwinter in some arrested state. It might be the pupae, it might be the larvae, and then they don't come out again until it's time for their next generation, which might not be till the next year for many species. And so just to kind of zoom in on that phenomenon for a second, this image on the right shows a larvae who's just hatched, hatched recently, on one pollen ball. Unlike the really complex social structures of a honeybee, this is the complete and total amount of parenting that a bee gets, right? They don't get a whole group cohort of nurse bees. They don't have a cohort of guard bees, right? These are things you might know about honeybees, guarding their nest. They just have a little protected chamber somewhere in a log or in the soil, and their mom gave them a really big ball of pollen that's enough food for them to eat until they're a grown-up. And then she would have checked carefully to make sure that that little chamber doesn't have any parasitoids, predators, or other pathogens in it. She closes it off, and then she dies, and that's the whole parenting that they get. And for some species, it's very poorly known. For many species, how many pollen grains are in these balls of pollen. But for the couple sets of bees, we actually have numbers for. There might be over 30,000 pollen grains which could take, somewhere between 5 and 40 visits to flowers in order to get that many back. So it's a lot of work. And here's a little picture of what it can look like underground, a kind of schematic idea. If you have a little tunnel underground, and then you have these little isolated chambers with different babies off of them. And so 70% of our bees have this kind of underground soil nesting. So roughly 90% are solitary, roughly 70% are soil nesting. And yeah, like I mentioned before, most species have one generation per year. The baby bee won't finish maturing and then emerge until that same time the next year. And then you say, okay, but Kass, right, like you showed this life cycle, there aren't only bees in April, so instead we have all these solitary bees that are active at different times throughout the year. There's the ones that were out in April, but then there's others that are going to come out in May, others that come out in June, others that don't come out until the fall, and then our specialists on aster pollen, right, when all the goldenrods and symphytrichum are blooming. Very cool. Okay. So that's the solitary bee life cycle. We see this kind of cascading change in bees across the seasons. And then the other major life cycle, there's lots and lots and lots of complexity in this, but I'm kind of boiling it down to two for the purposes of today. Bumblebees are another really familiar native bee, right? You might have felt surprised when I said there's so many species of bees, but then we probably can all list, right? Bumblebees, carpenter bees, maybe you've heard of sweat bees or mason bees or cellophane bees, right? We're kind of like, oh yeah, so bumblebees are one of our most familiar and charismatic native bees. And unlike, they are social, but unlike a honeybee, they don't live in colonies throughout the winter. They're actually solitary in the winter, so right now, all the bumblebees that you've ever seen, if they're part of a living legacy, they're out being solitary right now under the snow. And they're only going to be social again in the summer. And so what that looks like is if you're this bumblebee queen, can you still hear me if I do this? No, I won't do that. Okay, anyway, she's here. And then I'll stick with you, Mike, I'm sure that's helpful. So they'll look for a place to overwinter at the base of a tree, in the soil, in the leaf litter, and then they won't come out again until the spring, and then start stocking up on pollen and nectar in the understory and the canopy, and then they'll found a new colony, and then you have that active, vibrant bumblebee colony all season long, but it dies back down again before winter, and then only the new queens survive the winter. I'm happy to talk, I will talk more about bumblebee life cycles later on, but just wanted to give you that grounding for now. And so then if we map this like summer social group and we add them kind of in this cartoony way over the schematic, then there are species who we do see all season long. As those other solitary bees are kind of shifting across the season, there are species that we will see all year, but their life stages might be changing. Like those bumblebee queens at the beginning, then the workers, then next year's queens and the males at the end of the season. But we'll see the common eastern bumblebee from spring till fall. So this leads to that complexity of community that we have. Okay, so we have all this diversity. Why do we care? Many of us just care. But there's lots of ways to think about it. And we know that biodiverse wild pollinators are really important in addition to being intrinsically beautiful and magical. In agricultural and other pollination settings, they provide really crucial crop pollination, seed set, and fruit set for wild plants, including rare and declining plants. We know that across larger spatial and temporal scales, we need more bees in order to guarantee we get the same amount of pollination service. Right? If you grow the same plant today and you grow it again in 4 weeks, you might need a different community of bees to make sure you get pollination because of that complexity in community, or because the bees that fly now are more threatened by habitat loss than those ones. You need that diversity in order to ensure consistency of pollination. Many studies in many different ways show that diversity loss reduces plant reproductive success. And many of these, of course, are threatened, as I mentioned, by habitat loss, habitat quality decline, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and then synergistic and interacting factors that I won't really cover today, but many amazing people are working on, like pesticides, pathogens, homogeneous floral diets and simplified landscapes, and of course the interactions with many features of climate change. So, oops, sorry about that top line getting cut off here. I think one thing, a lot of people in this room who are probably avid naturalist scientists in your own right, deeply engaged community members, why haven't I heard of these native bees before? Like, some of you have, but it is kind of newer, right? Even if you have spent a lot of time hearing about it, it's been a more recent conversation for a lot of people. And a big part of that reason is before everyone was worrying about really high winter losses of honeybees in that kind of 2006, 2007 era when that was really hitting the headlines, there was just a lot less research attention, a lot less funding, and there's been an explosion of natural history research in pollinators over the last almost 20 years now. I think I can just start saying 20 years, I don't like that. That work really all started in agricultural systems, right? Everybody was saying, oh my God, if all the honeybees are dying at these rates, what if they all go away? Which of course they haven't, right? But what if they all go away? What's gonna happen to all of our food systems? So the research first started in food systems, so I'm gonna kind of give it to you in that arc, which is that starting in many agricultural systems where people did say, oh wow, there are a lot of native bees and they are doing a lot of this good work. And so, I should point out are many other invertebrates. this is a bee talk. So I'm not ignoring them. I'm just staying in my lane here. Work in those agricultural systems was correlated broadly with higher pollinator abundance diversity when there was large amounts of natural habitat nearby. Large amounts of natural habitat nearby a focal ag field would also buffer effects of pesticide exposure in those fields. Sometimes was correlated with lower pathogen loads, and you would often see these higher pollination rates, bee diversity, abundance, which could translate even to higher crop yields in agricultural settings. And so, I put natural habitats up first because that's kind of the broader category, but when we zoom into forests and hedgerows, we do continue to see this relationship and have found that those habitat types have been linked to pollination success, both at landscape scales within a single orchard row, which is pretty astonishing that you could measure, how close am I in an orchard row to the edge of the forest and actually see a change in the bees, right? Insects move around a lot, ecology is messy, pretty astonishing, and even seen implications for fruit quality in crops such as strawberry and apple. So here's just a figure showing as surrounding natural area increased around a bunch of different apple orchards. As the amount of forest and natural habitat increased, the number of bee species and abundance increased as well. And one pattern within that pattern is that the spring crops, including orchards, were most clearly supported by these adjacent forests, hedgerows, and woodlots. And research has shown that even small forest patches can be really important in these agricultural landscapes. This is a pattern that's been found in lots and lots of different systems all over the country. And then when we just think about the resources provided by a tree, even a single tree in an isolated landscape can provide a lot of resources. And so I wanted to highlight this kind of spring phenomenon here with why are we seeing this if we know this happening in spring, I'm going to come back to that, but the vast majority of our recommendations for pollinators, including the vast majority of the things promoted by Xerces, which are all good, include kind of focusing on these summer-long meadows and wildflower strips in our gardens with continuous flowers from June to October, right? I see some people nodding in the audience. That may be a guideline that you're pretty familiar with. It's certainly something we talk about when we're doing like meadow design or something, is do you have that early summer, that midsummer, and then late summer. But we started at the very beginning with a life cycle of a bee that flies in April. If you're designing a meadow with blooms from June to October, you're only catching a part of the community, right? It doesn't mean you're doing something bad. There's a lot of bees that fly in that period and a lot of midsummer crops who you can be supporting if you have increased those later season resources, especially if they're missing in your landscape and if that habitat type makes sense for your landscape. But what about this earlier part of the year, right? So I'm going to dig into that a little bit more and then try to pull it all together. So some really interesting research was looking at spring blooming blueberries and tart cherries and found that the communities of bees found on those blueberries and cherries didn't overlap at all with the wildflower strips that had been planted next to them, which was pretty astonishing. So just to explain this figure for a minute, don't worry about the axes so much. It's like a summary of many, many variables statistically. But if the dots in those circles don't overlap, it means that that whole group of bees was different. So you can see that the circle for the enhanced wildflower does overlap with the circle for the unenhanced wildflowers. So those bees were kind of similar in some ways between the weedy edge of the field and the edge of the field with added flowers. But then when they looked at all the bees in the blueberries, they were completely different bees, right? It doesn't mean it was bad to support the bees with the wildflowers. Those were probably good bees to support, but it wasn't going to necessarily contribute to the blueberry pollination. And that was even more dramatic in tart cherry, where you can see that that group of bees is really, really a different group of bees in those cherries than it was in those enhanced herbaceous and control herbaceous areas, right? And so, again, not a bad thing, just different groups of organisms. And instead, when they zoomed in, I'm just going to show you some of the cherry results here on what the non-cherry pollens that those bees were carrying were. They were primarily spring woody plants. And it was willow, and it was maple, and it was cherry, and then it was other kind of shrubbier woody plants, like beloved sumac often gets a bad rap for being scrubby. It's an amazing plant for bees. Raspberries, you know, another one people either love or love to hate. And similarly in apple orchard systems in upstate New York, you know, some really cool work focused on bees only caught in apple orchards was that the other pollens that those bees were carrying were really heavily tree and shrub dominated. They included cherry and maple and willow and even wind pollinated species like ash, and that should say birch, not beech, and hawthorn, right? And so just these amazing woody plant dominated pollen loads that are saying, wow, what's going on here, right? So if we come back to this year-long bee community, there's a ton of important work that we do when we enhance June through October, especially in areas with lots of lawn or, you know, cool season grasses and no late season blooms. That's incredibly important work. But we also need to be thinking about this early season, which, you know, in a simplified kind of way is pretty much our trees and our shrubs and our forested areas. This is the zoomed out big picture, right? Okay, so that lets us kind of talk about now, what does it mean to be a forest-associated bee? Are you with me? All right, cool. You know, we all are like, what do you mean there's bees in the woods? But we live in a forest-dominated landscape, right? Forests cover this land when we leave a field behind. The colonists cleared all of this land, and then we left a lot of agricultural fields, and they've all turned back into our second growth forests that people like Mike and Great Mountain Forest steward so carefully, right? And so many of you in this room. And so it maybe shouldn't feel I say maybe, right? It maybe shouldn't feel that surprising that there are pollinators who are associated with this dominant land cover, right? A lot of the work that we do with meadows is a little bit picked up from the prairie states and then made to adapt here. But our meadow systems and our early successional habitats out here in New England are a little bit different than those mixes and the ways that we put those flowers together. Whereas the legacies of forest health, forest dynamics, and forest communities are more what the evolutionary pathway of the bees of New England would have been engaging with as their dominant land cover. And I already kind of gave you this background that we've kind of overlooked this because there was just so much less attention on natural history of bees until the really huge concerns about colony collapse and honeybees. But it's also because for a lot of the year, we all walk around in the woods. It's pretty dark in the summer. You don't see that many bees in the deciduous understory. It's a pretty reasonable conclusion to come to. You walk into a field, there's all the bees on all the flowers. You walk into the woods, it's kind of dark. You maybe see one or two on, your late season shade-loving asters, and maybe that's it. Also, when the canopies do bloom, the pollen is really high up there and hard to reach. We kind of, showed you that some of us climb a little bit to try to get closer to it, but most of us don't. I don't anymore. My risk tolerance went down. And there's a lot of wind-pollinated trees in the forest also, so we just don't think of it as an important bee resource. So those are some of the reasons that I think about, like, why haven't we been talking about this before? But as people were looking at those agricultural trends, there are more and more people who are pollinator biologists saying, like, well, why do we keep seeing these strong positive relationships with these habitats that are dark, that are, you know, I don't see a lot of bees in them? What's going on? And so one really cool analysis, well, I'm going to show you two cool analyses from a research group in North Jersey that works kind of across the region here, where they did really careful sampling in really distinct landscapes, right? A lot of times when you do studies in New England, it's really hard to find truly all forested or truly all agricultural landscapes because we have such a matrix of everything mixed together. But they worked really hard to do careful site selection and looked at first when the bees were active and then which bees were in these different habitats, right? So forest in green, agriculture in yellow, urban in this kind of reddish pinkish color. And the first trend that jumped out and just screams at all of us is that this green is peaking in the springtime, right? Which I kind of have already warned you to look out for, and then drops off later in the season. That's when it's dark in the forest, right? Later in the season. And then these resources that are in these urban and agricultural habitats are pretty low in early spring because not everything's blooming out in those meadows in April, right? And then later in the season, they pick up again. There's no zero anywhere at any point, right? There's always complexity, but these are the big patterns. And then when they asked which species are these, and I'll tell you more about the species shortly, they actually were able to classify over 118 different species that were active across the mid-Atlantic and found that pretty much 32% of them, so almost a full third, were found in these mature forest landscapes. They were completely able to live their whole lives consistently in forest-dominated landscapes. Another third are what they call open habitat bees, and then another third are habitat generalists. And so there's actually this 68% of bees who seem to want some percentage of forest in their landscape throughout their life. Kind of the preview here for the rest of the talk is this early spring period is when we have, hopefully, healthy spring ephemeral communities covering the forest floor. And it is when the vast majority of our trees will bloom in spring. That's a lot of bees, right? And I think one other thing that I didn't put in here, but I want to mention is just these forest specialists, they call them, right? These ones that really can live their whole lives in forests. They did a really careful historical analysis of museum databases, this same research group, and looked at how those bees have changed since agricultural land abandonment and forest second growth, and found that only the forest-associated bees kind of were increasing in dominance over this period, in abundance. So secondary losses to those bees will be primarily due to habitat quality and degradation, but actually they have responded in the last 150 years to the return of the forest to the northeast, a pattern that they didn't see with the open habitat bees, right? Cool, so I like to just kind of show this another way that's maybe a little more pretty with more pictures. So this is kind of the same information, right? Bees are most abundant in forest-associated areas in spring. There's a little claytonia, spring ephemeral flowers. Tulip tree blooms a little later, but I couldn't resist that photograph of flowering tree canopies being so important. In the midsummer, we kind of see that kind of dribble off, but I would be remiss not to point out, some of our mid-season shrubs like Ilex verticillata or Blophilia, which do bloom more in that midsummer period and do provide summer forest resources. And then the late season asters, of course, pick up again. We have Solidago cesia, Solidago flexicalis, Symphydrichum cortifolium, some of these wonderful late season asters that are really shade loving and shade tolerant. Whereas in this kind of middle period, right, and I kind of threw in sunflower there with its amazing associated longhorn bees that love open habitat, right? And so you kind of, this is again a simplified kind of push and pull between these two extremes of the habitats. So who are these forest-associated bees? They come into a couple genera. So for anyone who's started to dabble in a next level of bee nerdery, these are some of your genera to look out for. If you don't like scientific names, don't worry about it. Just enjoy the pictures. But Andrina are the mining bees. They're my absolute favorite genus in the whole world, but they don't have to be yours. You can love other ones. And then there's Osmia, which include the leafcutter bees, the mason bees. Not the leafcutter bees, the mason bees. Nomata are kleptoparasites. Ask me about those in the Q&A. I didn't put them in the main talk today, but they are kind of secondarily parasitic on our forest bees and other spring-flying solitary bees. They're not just bad guys though, because if you see them year after year after year, you know you have your host population vibrantly thriving, so that's cool. Some of the bumblebees and some of the green bees, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then I'm just going to keep my time here next to me a little better. I'm running really long. Okay. Bumblebees also are understood to vary in their degree of forest association. We have about a third of, this was a whole separate research group, whole separate analysis. That bumblebees have this roughly, Bombus vagans is a representative of a bee that can live almost its whole life in mature forest habitats. Bombus impatiens is our common eastern bumblebee. I find that I see that one more and more and more dominantly in our communities around here. It is a habitat generalist, so maybe that shouldn't be super surprising, although we don't fully know the drivers of that. And then open habitat bees, Bombus fervidus is an example of a bee that really relies on much more open and cleared landscapes. And so these are, this third was also generated by this completely independent research group, but in the bumblebee group. And what does this look like then if you are thinking about forests at different stages of development? Well, what this can look like, if we think about forest age here, like maybe you have a clear cut, a standard placing disturbance, maybe a wind throw, maybe a hurricane, maybe a beaver dam just went away and you're starting fresh. And then you have all the way through to a mature forest. We often see a really big peak in the bees in that gap in the forest in that early period because you're both getting all the forest-associated bees who are able to use the flowers that are there, and they fly in, and they're like, great, a bunch of flowers for right now, and then they go home to the woods. And you get any open-associated bees who are nearby enough that they're like, oh cool, more open habitat with my favorite resources in it, that's awesome. And so that can often look like this just enormous flush of bee diversity and abundance. And then as the trees come in, right, they can grow in really densely and compete and have close stems. There's not as much flowering. During that middle period, sometimes the stem exclusion stage, they're not as abundant in the bees because there's not as much flowering, there's not as much structure, there's not a healthy developed understory again. But then once you get back out into mature forest structure, you get the mature forest bees come back. And so there's actually some pretty amazing research being done by some folks up at the Yale-Myers Forest in the northeast corner of this pretty cool state, where they're looking at a chronosequence, they call it, just means across time, of shelterwood harvests in the managed forest of Yale-Myers, looking at which bees they find in different ages of forest stands that were harvested one each year for the last 30 plus years. And they were able to see and have incredible record keeping, and they do see that big peak in bees at the beginning of, right after the clearing, because you get all the kinds of bees together. And then they see the bees go away, starting around year 10, once the raspberries are done and the tree stems are all competing. And then once that forest gets back to 30, the forest-associated bees come back. I'm going to give you one more level on this, which is that the full data set shows that kind of swoop shape also. But then if you look at the habitat generalists and the bees associated with open habitats, they're only peaking at the beginning, right? And then they drop off completely. Whereas the forest-associated bees were always higher because it's a forested landscape they're working in. And then they come back again once you get that differentiation of forest ages and structure in the mature forest. So you can see, one way to look at this figure, this one, would be, oh, well, there's the most bees in the patch cut or in the shelterwood or in the fresh harvest. But actually, that's because you're getting, the forest bees plus. And then the forest bees are back once you're in the forest itself. And then we know a lot less about management within forests, but I'm happy to talk more about that later. And so these forest-associated bees, it could be tempting if you just looked at that first figure on the left to say, oh, well, the bees are doing the best in the gaps, right? But if you lose the matrix of the whole mature forest, then you start to lose those forest-associated bees too. So that kind of needing all of those different age classes is how we maintain the full, vibrant community of the bees. And you see a turnover to different communities, right? Once you lose enough forest in the landscape, you start to have a community dominated by the open habitat bees. So we want to keep forests as forest, and then steward our forests. All right. Guys, I've been chatty. All right, I'm just keeping an eye on my time here. There's too many like friendly faces smiling back at me, so then I want to give the long version of each slide. It's your fault. Okay. So how do we think about this? You know, we know enough to act now, but there's still tons of open questions about a lot of natural history. I told you this is a really young field. How do we make choices, right? There's a lot of values that people bring to forests, right? We love them. They filter water. They offer climate resilience, carbon sequestration, invertebrate habitat, aesthetic, sense of place, yada, yada, yada. Should I just be like, well, here's what the bees do? Of course not, right? And so, I mean, this is maybe I don't need to put these slides in, but sometimes I think it's helpful for framing or something is, of course we're not gonna say that we maximize for bees is how we manage our forests only, but then neither do I want kind of to offer this peak of bees in an open habitat or the importance of mature habitat and then have that be kind of an oversimplified placeholder for either we must always, you know, we always need early successional habitat everywhere, or we never cut a tree ever. Instead, we want to think about the complexity and the diversity of these life cycles and think about what makes sense for this particular place and this particular landscape context, and then integrate, you know, as much biological complexity about the different life cycles that we have available to help inform this already really complex management landscape that people are working within. And so that's kind of why I like to ground in life cycles and start almost with too much complexity so that we can understand when and how they do or don't play into the conversation. Because forests are a crucial part of pollinator habitat, but forest health is, you know, not one easily defined thing. It's going to be place dependent, depends on management history and current pressures and needs, and the need for a given type of habitat or management will depend on landscape context and site-specific conditions. All right, so complex to complex here. Don't worry, this is about to get more fun. So, oh no, it's cut off at the top. Sorry, that says seeing the forest for the bees. I've been a little low on puns today. Maybe I should pick it up. Yeah, Billy's nodding. Okay. One thing that I like to do when I talk about bees in the woods is kind of think about a species or a group of species that connects to a certain type of habitat element in a forest that's often desirable, or often a principle that we want to think about ecological integrity. And so we have these different kind of representative groups or species of bees who each connect to a different forest habitat element in a different way. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of these in our remaining time to give you a little bit of introduction to what it looks like to start to see elements of them, even if you're walking around in the summer, a dark forest and wonder, oh, maybe a bee lives in that log, right? All right, so we're going to start with the understory, though, which is one of my favorite places, and this is the perfect time of year to have this talk because, in theory, winter will end, and the flowers hopefully will come back. I actually love winter, but to talk about the understory flowers, one of my favorite vehicles to kind of think about relationships between bees and the understory are specialist bees. What's a specialist bee? Well, we already learned about a short life cycle of the vast majority of adults, right? So suddenly, maybe it makes sense if you know you're only out for 4 to 6 weeks at the same time of year every year, that over evolutionary time, some of those bees have noticed, well, every time I'm ever out, there's trout lily. Why don't I just only feed my babies trout lily? That seems like an efficient project, right? And then they can get really, really good at it. They can learn to recognize it. They can learn to digest it. They can have perfectly spaced hairs on their legs that help them carry home exactly the shape and size of pollen that is the trout lily. It means that they don't have to figure out, look how little that bee is relative to those anthers, right? If you're that little, every shape of flower is kind of like an engineering puzzle, right? Where does it keep its pollen? Oh shoot, this piece of petal hit me in the face. How do I find the nectar, right? Whereas if you know exactly the shape of flower you're always interacting with, you can go and be like, great, oh, yep, this anther's open, awesome, pack it on your legs, fly home, right? Come back and get more. So it's a really good strategy. So you can be efficient, you can learn to eat a plant that other plants don't like. That's a really cool strategy too, because if there's a plant that has toxic pollen or a really weird flower shape, you might have less competition from other bees that haven't specialized on your shape of flower. So this is Andrena erythronii on Erythronium americanum, our trout lily bee on trout lily. That's Andrena distans on Geranium maculatum. We didn't know that it was the geranium bee when we named it, so it's not named Andrena geranii. They actually named the bee that uses hydrophyllum Andrena geranii, but because they didn't know. But then by the time they named its kleptoparasite, they named its kleptoparasite Nomata hydrophylla. So they had figured it out by then. So it's a pretty cool kind of set of naming and fun there. And here actually is a kleptoparasite. I'm not sure it's the kleptoparasite of that Andrena, but that's the kleptoparasite nectaring on a trout lily. And then here's the trout lily specialist getting pollen from the trout lily, right? This is the spring beauty mining bee, Andrena aerugeniae, doesn't have a matching name. But the pollen on Claytonia on spring beauty is pink. And so if you see a little black bee with 100% pink pollen in its little legs, probably the spring beauty mining bee, pretty cool. And this is a really fun paper from 1975. I just love these papers. The photos are just like this, where you can see this kind of sunny part of this maple forest, and then leaf out. And if you find the original PDF, I can send it to you. You can see the little dots with the entrances to the nests in this sunny part, and then you would never find them. Because the bees are done, they're not keeping the hole open anymore, leaves are falling, things are walking around. You'd never know by the time that life cycle is over, but they were nesting whole groups of them, each individual solitary bees, down these little tunnels. And then they're just waiting, right? That whole dark leafy out season, waiting until next year when the spring beauty. And if you get lucky, you can see their little faces poking up out of those little holes. Other specialist bees include the bee from violets and uvularia, and then my former colleague Maria Van Dyke led this publication, which is free as a PDF online, called Creating a Pollinator Garden for Native Specialist Bees. It's not focused on woodlands, but it includes all of the understory specialists that we're aware of, and also many, many other specialist relationships that are really fun to learn to recognize and appreciate in your landscape. So that's, if anybody's having trouble finding that PDF, just email me and I'll send it to you. So the bigger picture, understory herbaceous communities, under threat from a lot of different features. I often tend to highlight deer. We know that in many cases, deer selectively feed on native plants. Of course, different deer herds and regions, they have different preferences, but they can really decimate both our native tree understory, our seedlings, our tree regeneration, and our understory spring ephemerals and other spring flowering forbs. This is a paper that looked at the dietary preferences. Ooh, wow, I lost a piece of text there. I'll tell you what it said. That looked at the dietary preferences of the endangered rusty-patched bumblebee across the season. And they found that the early spring resources overlapped with when the queens were active, founding their new colony, and that those were the ones that in botanical records over the past 100 years were the ones in decline. So once the rusty-patched bumblebee colony was established, the workers and the later season taxa were using grasslands and wetlands in huge numbers, but those species were not found to be in decline in the botanical records, whereas the queens in early spring were using large volumes of early spring resources, and those were. I actually just found last night a paper from Virginia looking at the Virginia population of rusty patch. They just published a new paper, and they found kind of similar patterns in the very few extant populations in Virginia for this bee. So we don't know for sure that that's the smoking gun for why these bees are declining, but it certainly wouldn't help. It would work, right, to help restore understory populations. So one thing that I'm also going to highlight now is spring emerging or specialist native bees cannot switch to the pollen of an invasive species if they don't have that dietary flexibility, and if there's a mismatch in timing, right? Imagine you're a bee that flies in April. Even if you're a generalist bee who flies in April who does have dietary flexibility, because there are, if a shrub that doesn't bloom until June or July has taken over the understory, it doesn't matter how much pollen and nectar that shrub that blooms in July makes. The common eastern bumblebee will use it, some other summer bees might use it, you might see honeybees on it, but you're not going to be feeding the spring bees that shrub may have outcompeted. And so there's a couple studies on invasive honeysuckle removal, for example, and then they found that this relationship of the geranium specialist was restored after the honeysuckle was removed. And of course that means that the geranium had to be nearby enough to come back, and there still had to be populations of the bees somewhere in the habitat to be able to recolonize, because if you don't have a seed population, it may not be able to come back without assistance, and that gets complicated, right? So This was a really careful study. They tracked it all the way through to seed set of the geranium, which I thought was pretty amazing. And this is a study based out of Georgia that followed actually a Chinese privet removal in an understory in Georgia for 13 years, which is a really long time for ecology. And they found that the pollinator community was just leaps and bounds more diverse and abundant, and they also followed Lepidoptera in these understories following the privet removal. And one thing I really liked about this paper too is they also recorded the tree seedling regeneration, and were able to also show, all of the next generation of trees were able to establish again too. I think they had lower deer populations down there. Yeah, so, what do we think about this? Fencing around sensitive plant communities can be cost prohibitive, but maybe if it's a really, really special population, thinking about when and how it's economically and feasible to both maintain or at least stop the spread of major invasive species areas. Minimize soil disturbance. We know that second growth forests may, in many cases, have lower herb level diversity than some primary forests. There's context dependency there, but soil disturbance and tillage, we think, of a forest can impact what's able to grow there again in the future, at least without help. And then what does it look like to think about careful restoration of understory communities is a really important and interesting conversation. In a landscape scale, like if you're thinking about gardens, parks, and yards, one of my absolute favorite ways to just get a handle on this right away is what we call soft landings. If you've heard this term, it was popularized by Heather Holm, who's one of my heroes. And she worked with Doug Tallamy and Desiree Narango, who's at the Vermont Center for Ecosystem Studies and is amazing. And they were looking at the full life cycles of Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, that start their life cycles by chewing on the branches of important trees, right? All those reasons we know we love oaks if you're following Doug Tallamy's work, all these Lepidoptera up there in the sky. But in order to complete their life cycles, many of those Lepidoptera drop to the ground for an overwintering stage, for a pupation stage, etc. So if we have them as trees that are either in the city right on pavement, or functionally equivalent in many cases right on turf in the middle of a lawn, you actually might have done all that work to get that oak established and then have nothing to meet it when it drops, especially if you also have turf spray or just really intense mowing regime or any number of ways. So keeping leaf litter in what's called the drip line around the base of a tree, so just if you draw a line down from the branches, and then establishing all these wonderful plants that can thrive in the shade around the base of a specimen tree can help complete those life cycles. And Heather Holm's website is, again, email me if you can't find it, but easy to Google, these soft landing resources, and they have instructions for how to think about best practices for establishing them, that also maintain tree health and soil health. And they're just can be so beautiful in a landscape too. I think these are compatible with the most manicured all the way to the messiest, most naturalistic landscape. All right, let's talk about the green bee. I'm keeping an eye on the time here. So wood nesting bees are one of my favorite groups, and I know there's some folks interested in horticulture around here, or deadwood. So the shiny green bee can be an ambassador for deadwood. Some of our most charismatic flower visitors, in my opinion, are these iridescent shiny green and blue bees. Some nest in stumps in the understory, in standing snags. You can find them in non-forest habitats, even though in every classification they come out as forest associated. They will also go into I've seen them in park benches. They're pretty cool. And they're, we're also used to thinking of shiny bees, shiny insects in the woods as often being bad guys, like emerald ash borer and a lot of our other boring beetles. But luckily these are shiny green jewels you can just love. So, jewel-toned, common in farms and gardens, but need forests. They've even been found to collect walnut pollen, which is pretty cool, and they overwinter in these moist soils, kind of at the log soil interface, even though during the growing season nests are in the log itself. You can see they kind of excavate these tunnels with all their little chambers in them, which is a really cool paper from 1967 by Stockhammer, and they're really cute. So one thing that I think about in terms of landscape management, forest stewardship, is we think a lot about snag creation, large pieces of dead woody debris, all ages and sizes of decay classes of wood. And we don't know everything about these bees yet, but we know that they seem to choose bigger logs that are soft enough to excavate, but firm enough to maintain structure throughout the season and protect the larvae. So that's kind of like a specific amount of punkiness or softness that that log has to have that might be too far gone after 2 or 3 more years. And so you need this kind of continuous supply of deadwood over time, right? With new trees growing, new trees maturing, aging, and falling in order to always have the right size and structure of these logs to maintain this community. So yeah, the descendants will need a new log. I had a tree that I climbed pretty often at the beginning of grad school where I found shiny green bee nest in a dead branch of an otherwise healthy oak, and it was full of green bees, and I would go back and check it every year, and after 3 years it was on the ground. It had fallen out of the tree. And so I was like, where did the babies go? I don't know. I didn't climb the right tree, I didn't find it. So, that's that kind of logic though, right? Yeah, so I just wanted to show you, this is gonna be a bad video on purpose, okay? Because you might be like, okay, Kass told me there's bees in these logs, they're really hard to find. So I was hiking in the Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey, got a little tired, stood and decided to just drink my water while staring at the snag, because that's the kind of fun thing you can do if you hang out with me. And just, stare at stumps. And okay, ready? I'll play it a couple times. Oh, there it went. Did you see it? No. Okay, some of you saw it. The whole point is you might not have seen it, right? Okay, I'm going to play it and then I'm going to go point. So, there. See it? So, they're really hard to see. They're really easy to miss. And that wasn't a shiny bee. That was a mason bee, I'm pretty sure. That was, using that little abandoned beetle burrow. But that's why we need that stump. And we would hardly ever know it if I hadn't happened to get thirsty in that moment. I would have walked right by, right? It took me a while to get that bad video too. So, there's also bees that will nest in suspended soil in the tip-ups of a big tree. So, this isn't mess, this is habitat, this is soil. These are soil nesting bees. They're kind of hard to see, but you'll see little bright glints. Beep, beep. Wait for it. There they go. See? Bloop, bloop, bloop. They were all nesting in the soil there. Again, really hard to see, tiny little black bees using the tip up. There, see they're going in those little holes there. And there's only one paper with anecdotal reference of this being done. But when I talk to naturalists, they're like, oh yeah, I've seen bees in the soil of the tip ups, it's a cool thing. So, this is kind of this broader concept of decaying down deadwood, keeping continuous supplies of multiple ages of species, multiple sizes and complexity. And just the enormous diversity. Bees are a great ambassador. Almost everybody wants to quote unquote save the bees. And I think bees are a really great ambassador for this type of work, and they can help invite people into just this astonishing array of organisms that use deadwood. And they can be incorporated really tastefully into gardens, depending on the level of aesthetic requirement of the landscape you're working in. I think they can be these park benches. That one on the right there is a pollinator garden that ended up being absolutely stunning in Philadelphia, right in the city, and it worked really well. And they all talk with every time there's a volunteer group, they talk about how the logs are part of the pollinator garden. So, all right, let's see. Am I okay to keep going? It's 1:04. I just want to tell 1 or 2 more stories and then leave 15 minutes to. Okay, just want to make sure to respect the. Great. So bumblebee queens, I want to talk about again a little bit. So as we kind of talked about in the life cycle at the beginning, but I want to say again, each overwintering bumblebee queen represents a new colony the following year. So some really amazing research from the Crone Lab at Tufts was looking at first how easily you can detect bumblebee nests in different landscapes, which is really difficult work, and nest searching takes a long time. And then they also tracked all of the colonies that they found in meadows, fields, non-meadow fields, and forests, and then tracked the reproduction of new queens the next year. And they were able to find that at least they either had the same or higher reproductive and overwintering success of those colonies in forests than the ones in the meadows. So they're producing more next year's queens in those colonies. making sure we have protected sites for these bumblebees is a really important thing that can be hard to actionably do, right? We just need the habitat to be there for them to use it. They're hard to create. But anyway, so I'm going to back up a little bit. Why do we want to do this for our bumblebees? You know, they're highly effective pollinators of both wild and crop plants. Happy to talk more about that. Some people call them the teddy bears of the bee world because they're so fuzzy and familiar, and you know, they don't bother us unless you're up in their nest. Which is rare. Unfortunately, we do know that more than a quarter of bumblebee species are facing some degree of extinction risk, and we already talked about the federally listed rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis. So where are these places that they nest and then overwinter? We know some of their favorite places to nest are abandoned rodent burrows, or other similarly protected areas like this hollowed out log that has enough softness inside but structure outside. So, yeah, this is a photo by Heather Holm of these common eastern bumblebees zipping in and out of this hole in a log. Stone walls, brush piles. Many of you with backyards have probably encountered a bumblebee colony in that type of protected area under the base of a grass tussock, kind of thing like that. Then once that colony dies down, and then I was talking about overwintering, there's still a lot to learn about overwintering, but the kind of limited knowledge that we do have about where these queens choose to spend their winters are often in the sloping riparian areas of a forested section where there's kind of softer soil that they can excavate. Sloping shaded areas. A couple studies have even said that they prefer north-facing slopes, which are colder. And the reason that they infer for that is that, you know, we just had a really warm week, even though it got cold again, right? And so if you're a bumblebee who gets tricked and tries to wake up in a warm week in February, you might burn through all your fat stores while there's no flowers. And you worked really hard to build up those fat stores in order to survive the long, cold winter. And so the colder your overwintering place is, the more likely you are to survive that whole winter, because you're not likely to wake up a bunch of times. Those studies also have shown that they're more likely to be close to the base of a tree than far away, but that's only a couple species, we haven't studied them all. And some species have been shown to overwinter just a few meters away from their nest, which is pretty cool. So, you know, what are kind of the management implications? At a large scale, I think it's just minimize unnecessary soil disturbances. A lot of this will be following best stewardship practices for things like forest management anyway, trying to work in ways that don't churn the soil or cause a lot of erosion or compaction, protect stream edges and riparian zones, yet another reason, right? There's so many other reasons already to do that. And then this kind of, I don't know, perhaps, what's the word, you know, aspirational suggestion, which is if we do think that the queens are largely overwintering just a few meters from their natal nest, then maybe we just want to think about trying to protect a buffer around last year's known nest with any management areas. But that's, you know, that might be really tricky depending on the context, but might be possible in some specific scenarios. All right, now I'm going to talk about the canopy, and then we're going to wrap up, and I can't wait to hear all of your thoughts. So there's a lot of relationships between pollinators and the canopy, and this is kind of when I get the most excited, and you might be like, she gets more excited about this? So I'm sorry about that. These are some that are barely understood at all, but I like to highlight them because I don't have time to talk about honeydew today, which is kind of a sugary secretion that sap-sucking insects poop out and bees will use if there's a nectar dearth due to a drought. Wow, that's really cool. Those are often on softwoods, so that's a reason. Bees don't really use conifers, but maybe that's a time that they do. This is an oak gall that produces a tiny bit of nectar. This honeybee was found nectaring preferentially on this tiny little oak wasp gall that produces a tiny bit of sugar. There's some anecdotal or some preliminary studies that show that two families of bees are more likely to collect resins and saps from things like populus buds. You know, poplar pollen isn't known to be that good for bees, but the sticky buds some groups will take home to help waterproof their nests. There's certainly mating that happens. That's a red maple flower. Those are cellophane bees mating on a flower there. We know that a lot of bees will look for high places in order to mate or to patrol for mates. So trees can offer that in an otherwise, you know, untreed landscape or in a forest. And then microhabitat, shelter from the wind, transit corridors. This was a little kleptoparasitic bee on a really rainy day, just holding on to a little box elder seed forming there, just kind of like shuddering. And it was like, okay, I guess this little area is less windy than 10 meters away. But the main thing I really wanted to talk about when we think about the canopy is this phrase we like to use, that each blooming tree is a temporary meadow in the sky. It doesn't bloom for as many weeks or months as a meadow does, but when it does, it's making a huge amount of pollen. And some studies just in the last couple years have started to show that the diversity of hardwood trees within an area is positively correlated to the diversity and abundance of bees in that forest area. So, right, like if you're in a forest, the higher the diversity of hardwoods, the more bees you have. Only a couple of studies there, but it's pretty cool. Different trees bloom at different times, right? Some trees bloom in early March, some bloom in mid-March, depending on where you are. Some in April, some in May, some in June. And not every tree blooms every year, right? Many of our, we know about masting oaks, right? They also have to flower before they make acorns. They don't make acorns every year, they don't flower every year, right? That's either 1 or 2 years prior to acorn set, depending on whether they're white or red oaks. So the higher tree diversity provides a greater continuity and diversity of pollen and nectar resources than having a single tree species, is our understanding. And so, in some of these extension materials we're developing, I use the cellophane bee, which is a really cool bee genus, to kind of talk about this, because the unequal cellophane bee seems to have strong preference for willows and maples. Super cool. Often nests in the forest, then loves to forage in these riparian areas full of maples and willows. Whereas Calides validus, a different bee in this same genus, pretty much only uses ericaceous shrubs. So it's going to be in a different forest type, right? Or maybe it's going to come out later if you're in, a fire-driven part of New Jersey, and then there's maple along the water that the Calides inequalis uses, but then later in the season, all the blueberries and the cranberries and the Gay-Lusacia start blooming, and then your Calides validus is happy. And that's going to be a totally different forest type than where Calides thoracicus prefers to forage, which is on tulip trees, and sometimes also cherries and holly. But you don't get liriodendron usually with, a thick blueberry understory. Those are often different forest types with different soils and different histories. And so you're going to have different bees associated with these different communities. So I like to think about this genus as like an example of that nuance and a reason for keeping place-based specificity and diversity of your taxa. And then I just couldn't resist throwing in a little note about the mining bees. There's a couple who really love oaks, a whole bunch that love maple, and then there's Tupelo or Nyssa sylvatica. Black gum has one really cool paper from the 80s called sparkle flowers, because it has a big blob of nectar that sticks out of it. And those sparkle flowers are a paper that Suzanne Batra named for bees as being really important nectar producers in certain times of year. So, oak, cherry, hickory, linden, really important resources for both bees and Lepidoptera. Well-known spring resources are maple and willow, kind of reiterating here, things I've already said, but here's an Andrina foraging on a willow flower. We also talked about specialists already. There's over 30 species of willow specialists, which is pretty cool. And then one thing that I've kind of listened past but want to talk about very briefly is that it seems like maybe some bees will collect wind-pollinated pollen, which maybe if you have those little plantago, those little plantains in your yard that have that little ring of pollen, right? Those are wind-pollinated. You always see the bumblebees on them and then they tip over. Or if you have a little patch of corn, if you ever see the tassels, the bees will come to the tassels of the corn, right? So we do know that bees use wind-pollinated pollen because are they trying to pollinate the plants? No, remember how much pollen they're trying to take home? They're trying to feed their babies, right? So as long as there's the right pollen nutrition in that pollen, they'll use it. And so when we're thinking about these trees, we can also include wind-pollinated trees as possible hosts. Not necessarily. We know that pine are so selected to fly so far away, they have less than 10% protein. Doesn't really seem like that many bees collect pretty much any conifer pollen, at least successfully or more than incidentally at all. But a lot of our hardwood trees have, 18 to 25% protein, which is pretty comparable with a lot of insect-pollinated trees, and some taxa seem to use them. They're not more important, but they're just also part of the story. And when you're a wind-pollinated tree, you make a shocking amount of pollen because your actual reproductive strategy doesn't use the bees still, right? It's still relying on the wind to carry hundreds of millions of pollen grains in hopes that it lands on the female flower of a conspecific tree. But that means that if the bee can use it, if it is nutritionally sufficient, it's a stunning amount of pollen. The average amount for a sugar maple tree is 100 billion pollen grains. And when we calculated this, I was like, I don't know about that. And then we checked the allergen literature, which I hate to invoke, and they agreed. So it's true. And here's some really fun old data from a 1950s something paper where they were taking the pollen loads off of a couple different species of andrina and found, oopsie, I thought that was gonna play, and found that they had, really large amounts of oak, beech, maple, and of course chestnut in their pollen loads. And this is just a video I took of bees collecting pin oak pollen on a sunny day. And this tree was just buzzing and buzzing and buzzing. And it's just going up and down that ripe catkin collecting pollen. The female flower probably isn't even receptive that day because they don't want to accidentally pollinate themselves. They want to outcross, and it's on a different part of the branch. So we don't think the bee is doing any pollination for that oak tree. It's just like, oh cool, protein, great, I'll take it home. There we go. And this is some data from my dissertation where we did trapping in canopy, understory, and orchards, identified all the pollen, and just found that the yellow bars are just pollen from the canopy. So across time, we found that there was a lot of canopy pollen in the pollen loads carried by bees who were caught both in the understory and caught in traps in the canopy. But that we underestimated it if we only caught bees in the understory. We saw, both more pollen in the bees that we had caught in the canopy and a higher percentage of canopy pollen. But it was pretty stunning. We were curious. We didn't know we were going to find that much. It was a lot of maple, and then some oak was kind of the dominant pollen that we found. That's what I just said. But some scattered beech, birch, walnut, ash, but much less. Ash pretty much had died though. I think one more data point that I want to show here, and then I want to wind down, is just that Professor Katie Turo, who's now at Fordham, she was at Rutgers, did a really extensive amount of sampling across multiple ecoregions in New Jersey, from the Pine Barrens all the way up into Delaware Water Gap, which is much more comparable habitat to around here, and then grouped the pollen types that were used by bees categorized as habitat generalists versus forest specialists. And what I want you to just see here is that this forest specialist blob has a lot more brown pollen, right? And those are the tree and shrub pollens. So these forest-associated bees are using, not only is everybody who's out in the spring going to be using more forest-associated pollen, but especially the forest-associated taxa are going to be using a lot more tree and shrub pollen. These are unpublished data that she was said I had permission to share with this group. So these should be out soon. And so the kind of bigger picture zooming out here, when a plant species is lost to disease or pests, its fauna is of course going to be threatened. Some associated insects or other taxa are going to be able to switch hosts, but others might not be able to, like we already talked about with the understory. And I always like to think about the chestnut in this context, right? We lost the functionally extinct chestnut tree that many people are working to reintroduce now around mid-century. And that tree produced shocking amounts of pollen and nectar during a period of the summer when not many other trees were blooming, late June, early July. Not a lot of other forest trees are blooming at that point. And we don't really know how many specialists we lost. I was just rehearing the number of leps, and I don't want to get it wrong right now, but there were a lot of moths and butterflies. And then also the chestnut bee, which uses only chestnut pollen to rear its babies, is still around. So some of you may have heard of this. They first found it, I think, down in Maryland, and now there's an amazing network in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and they just found it at SUNY ESF and the chestnut orchards up there. So this bee somehow they first refound it on a chinkapin, and now they're finding it on all the hybrids, and now there's more targeted sampling on lingering stump-sprouting American chestnut, and they're finding it there too, in kind of single ones. So an incredible bottleneck, but also maybe potential to abundantify. So as more species are facing kind of these existential pests and pathogens, right, we want to think about the faunas that are associated with them. Oh, well, here's my chestnut bee slide, I forgot. Yeah, just kind of historical range overlap between the chestnut bee on the left here and where chestnut was, and then just I've gotten the chance to sample in some chestnut orchards, and it's just amazing, the sheer number of invertebrates that are running up and down those amazing stinky, stinky flowers. So it really is hard to imagine our forests with that much chestnut. I like to kind of just remind everyone that this is true in forests, but also in our urban landscapes and our suburban landscapes. Every tree we add, tree diversity, redundancy, both for disease resilience as well as for this diversification of floral resources across space and time. It can't be understated how important it is. And I like to think about these little bees whose life cycles maybe you have a better handle on now, nesting in one part of a landscape, but then flying at different times of year to different resources across their habitat in order to get their full nutrition for their whole life cycle. And I think I want to kind of wrap up here. I've said most of the things I want to say throughout the talk, even though I have some summary slides here, but I'd love to hear what any questions that folks in the audience have. So maybe I'll just jump to kind of this little summary slide and stay here while we chat. We know bees use pollen in the canopy. We know they nest in deadwood. We know they will collect pollen and nectar from understory flowers, and that they also rely on forest habitats for nesting and overwintering.